Hello everyone, thank you for coming to our second speaker of the semester. Great to see everyone here. A lot of people who, for all those who were not here for the first talk, it will be posted online soon. The video is being edited by folks up in Logan, and that will be posted on the website, eastern.usu.edu/speaker-series. This talk will also be there once it is recorded and edited and everything else, so yes, we are being recorded. So I will, just to kind of recap where we were, this is again a three-part series this semester, kind of being done in conjunction with America 250 Utah. We are exploring the idea of public commons, public lands, and a lot of things that do make Utah what it is. So I'm not going to belabor that point too much. I'll introduce tonight's speaker, Michael Ann Nelson, professor of English, who I have worked with since I got here, and also was one of the members of my hiring committee. And I'll always say, if you have any problems with me, you can blame the hiring committee. You can also blame Sunshine.
You could always do that.
Anyway, Michael Ann Nelson, professor of English, wonderful professor, also director of the Writing Center, and I don't know, what else can we say about Michael Ann?
So I research wilderness in the United States, public lands, do a lot of work with Colorado River and Colorado River literature. That's kind of my area. I've been working on a book about Glen Canyon literature, which some of you may know as Lake Powell. And I do a lot of work with our nation's public lands.
And which is why when I was dreaming up this series, I knew I wanted to do something about the national parks and public lands and how it came to be in the United States. And I may have pitched Michael Ann a little bit on this idea, but just whenever I think of, especially some of the themes of this with public lands and commons, my brain always goes back to Wallace Stegner's famous quote. So with that, I will pass it off to Michael Ann. Thank you.
Oh, hey. Thank you so much, Michael. I tweaked the title of the talk just slightly. We came up with this idea back in August, it was, and so Michael's like, you got to get your titles in. And I was like, well, we're kind of leaning in this direction. But it really explores the connections between art and activism on behalf of our national parks. So I will start with Wallace Stegner, though. Okay, there we go. Wallace Stegner is one of Utah's most famous writers. He was raised in Salt Lake City, and he considered Utah his home. And he graduated from University of Utah before, and then after that, he went to University of Iowa to get his PhD in English. And after that, then he was hired at Stanford University to run their creative writing program, which he did for 25 years, starting in 1945. He won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction in 1972 for Angle of Repose, and then he also won the National Book Award for fiction in 1977 for The Spectator Bird. But I know him as a writer who spent a lifetime redefining what Western writing meant and using his pen to advocate for environmentalism. In the 1960s, he served on the board of directors for the Sierra Club, as well as a special advisor to then Interior Secretary Stuart Udall. So, in the spring, I'll use the thing. In the spring edition of Wilderness, spring 1983 edition of Wilderness, which was the magazine of the Wilderness Society, Stegner had penned a 7-page article titled "The Best Idea We Ever Had, an Overview." The article begins, "Let me bear my testimony, as the Mormons say, and acknowledge the debt I owe to a federal bureau for more than 50 years of physical and spiritual refreshment, and for the reassurance it gives me that despite all its faults, democracy is still the worst form of government except all the others." Stegner then goes on to provide a brief overview of the history of our national park system, and then finally getting to the purpose for writing the article at the end of it, where he says, "There is no park area, not even the most remote, that has not suffered demonstrable damage at the hands of then Secretary of the Interior under the Reagan administration, James Watt." While the immediate context for Stegner's article has passed, his idea that the national park system is the best idea we ever had has endured. And we'll get back to Stegner in a little bit. As we celebrate 250 years of America, we celebrate the best our country has to offer. And last month, Michael introduced us to the idea of the commons, and as was fitting, the refinement and growth of the public library system in the U.S. and how libraries democratized access to knowledge and learning. The national park system democratized access to public lands for the people. In a 1903 address Teddy Roosevelt gave at Yellowstone National Park, he said, "I cannot too often repeat the essential feature of the principle behind Yellowstone and other national parks is its essential democracy. It is the preservation of scenery, of the forests, of the wilderness life, and the wilderness game for the people as a whole, instead of leaving thereof to be confined to the very rich who can control private reserves." The idea that we would take lands out of production and set them aside for everyone to enjoy was revolutionary in 1872 when Yellowstone was established as our nation's first national park. But several things had to happen before we got to that point. First of all, the decision to establish a national park, chief among them was the precedent of establishing Yosemite as a park in 1864, though it was not officially a national park. The movement of Anglo settlers across the country into areas previous unknown to lawmakers and the use of the land as it has always been collided with dramatic landscapes and people who cared about and wanted to preserve and protect them. In 1851, the Mariposa Battalion had been sent to the Sierra Nevadas to evacuate Native American tribes from their homelands and onto reservations. They stumbled upon Yosemite Valley, which belonged to the native Awana-Ichi. Their report would be the first written account of Yosemite Valley. Then about 5 years later, a man named James Mason Hutchings read the Mariposa Battalion's report and thought that Yosemite would make a great tourist attraction, and he set about to write his first tourist guide. Well, a little while later, in July 1861, photographer Carleton Watkins lugged thousands of pounds of photography equipment into Yosemite Valley by mule, including a huge stereoscopic camera which recorded image and 3D detail, along with 30 glass plates that weighed 4 pounds each. And if you guys don't know what a stereoscopic camera is, if you've ever seen those old viewers where there's the 2 pictures side by side and you have to put it in there and then there's that 3D image, that's what he was trying to create and replicate. So he sent these images. These were the first images ever made of Yosemite Valley. And he sent them back east to be displayed at the Gulpole Gallery in New York in 1862. There, the images garnered a lot of attention from influential and wealthy individuals from the East Coast. In fact, Ralph Waldo Emerson declared that his images of the massive sequoia grizzly giant made the tree possible. For these photographs provided evidence of its existence. The photographs also inspired several other artists to visit, including painter Albert Bierstadt and landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted. And Frederick Law Olmsted was the person who designed New York Central Park. Albert Bierstadt established his reputation as part of the Hudson River School of Painters, an informal group of painters who started painting along the Hudson River in upstate New York right about 1825. This group of painters is considered one of the first American schools or movements of painting, and their goal was to capture a more romantic view of the American landscape. So in 1863, after seeing these photographs of Yosemite, Bierstadt determined to travel to Yosemite himself, where he spent 7 weeks painting Yosemite Valley. In fact, Bierstadt's Yosemite paintings became famous, and in 1867, Connecticut financier LeGrand Lockwood purchased the 9.5-foot by 15-foot. Try to just imagine, that's the size of bigger than my living room, right? I mean, that's a huge painting. And it was titled The Domes of the Yosemite for then price $25,000. I adjusted that for inflation today, and it's over it's like $4 million, and it was the most amount of money that anybody had ever paid for an American painting to that point in history. There was some concern that the giant sequoia, and so there was a lot of concern actually that the sequoias would be logged and lands privatized around Yosemite Valley. So then California Senator John Conness was inspired by the images of Yosemite that were made by Bierstadt and Watkins, and he introduced a bill in Congress to save Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa sequoias. So this is his bill. The Mariposa Big Tree Grove is really the wonder of the world. The trees contained in that grove have no parallel. They are subject now to damage and injury, and this bill proposes their preservation, that they should be used and preserved for the benefit of mankind. It is a matter involving no appropriations whatsoever. The property is of no value to the government. The lands were to be released to California for caretaking. The bill passed almost unanimously, and on June 3, 1864, President Lincoln signed into law the first federal lands recognition for protections and preservation for all people to enjoy. Almost all the people who voted for their preservation had never seen the land in question themselves, only the images that Conness circulated with the bill. The campaign to save Yosemite Valley from privatization established a close connection between art and public lands legislation that would be copied for decades to come. So thus, when Yellowstone's natural wonders started to attract attention after its initial survey in 1870, concerns about privatization, unregulated hunting, and land use began to surface. Ferdinand Hayden, head of the U.S. Geological Survey, put together an expedition in the summer of 1871 to confirm the data from initial reports. He took landscape artist Thomas Moran with him to document the expedition. Before Moran painted the Yellowstone region and made his sketches bring it to life, the American people had trouble believing the reports of the wonders it held. People called it like Colton's Hell and Sulphur Springs, and people just really didn't believe the reports that people were writing that were coming out of Yellowstone, like this doesn't really exist. So when Bierstadt comes and he makes paintings of Yellowstone, it really can affirm for people that this place and its wonders were really in existence. He captured the national imagination with his majestic paintings and sweeping landscapes, and he cemented for the first time one of the national treasures of the region. From his initial sketches, Moran painted the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, another huge 7 by 12-foot painting that overlooks Yellowstone River. The painting was bought for $10,000 by Congress and displayed in the United States Capitol, and it was met with critical acclaim. The poet and editor Richard Weber Gilder called it the most remarkable work of art which has been exhibited in this country for a long time. The painting also captured the public's imagination and influenced the decision to preserve Yellowstone National Park for future generations. I thought this was kind of cool to see a copy of the original bill. So the language says that be it enacted that the tract of land lying near the headwaters of the Yellowstone River is hereby reserved and withdrawn from settlement, occupancy, or sale under the laws of the United States and dedicated and set apart as a public park or pleasuring ground for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. So on March 1st, 1872, General Ulysses S. Grant, who was then president, signed the bill into law creating Yellowstone National Park. But because it was in the territory of Wyoming, and Wyoming was under federal jurisdiction, since it wasn't a state yet, it became the first national park in the history of the world. And Thomas Moran's painting is often credited with helping to establish Yellowstone National Park. This was a fun one. In researching this talk, I hadn't heard about Virginia Donahue McClurg before, and when I learned about her contributions to public lands, I just thought it was such a cool story. So one of the most interesting art forms to help establish a national park was undertaken by a woman named Virginia Donahue McClure, and she was lobbying on behalf of Mesa Verde National Park. So in 1882, she had traveled to the area, and she was so impressed by the ruins that she wrote a series of newspaper articles, and she went on a lecture tour about it. And then as publicity of the area spread, people came to the cliff dwellings to look for relics. And without any protections for the cliff dwellings, like pot hunting became a really popular pastime. And she was so concerned with the damage that was occurring to the cliff dwellings, she created the Colorado Cliff Dwelling Association in 1900 to advocate for the protection of the area. All of the members of the group were women, and she organized petitions, she wrote letters to the president, she encouraged other women's groups from across the country to do the same. So, in 1903, she won first place and $50 from the National Irrigation Congress for the best ode to irrigation. The poem was set to music and titled Irrigation Ode. It was sung by the Mormon Tabernacle Choir at Madison Square Gardens. And I am not sure how many politicians were swayed by McClure's song, but it was a really unique way to advocate for Mesa Verde's protection, and Mesa Verde did become the 7th national park on June 29th, 1906, when Teddy Roosevelt signed the law creating it. And just on this, I looked to see if there was an audio recording. I could not find an audio recording anywhere. We do have the sheet music. I think it's like 12 pages of sheet music. So I would have loved, I can't play the piano or sing, but it would be so fun to have somebody like play this composition, and so we could get a recording of it. And I can't read music either, so I have no idea. But this is, I think, the 5th page of the music that I copied on the second slide. And so it starts the second verse, and it kind of says, holder of the trails of life, the Pueblo prayers are answered. He furrows earth with stone-chipped knife where the frowning cannons bend and the foaming lines of the mountain stream he may turn and swerve. It's just this really fascinating, like, fun song celebrating the ancient Puebloans. So I thought that was just like a really fun, unique way to like advocate for Mesa Verde National Park.
It sounds like you're extending an invitation to Michael to learn this and play it.
I am not good at piano, but I was going to say, Christian, we could, fund some more music programs here. We could maybe get Larry to.
The choir! The choir can sing it.
I'm always going to advocate for
I would like that submitted in song.
I do now have an organ in my office, so I'll get right on that.
So this was like the most fun new thing that I discovered and to come across. All right. This guy is considered the founder of the National Park Service. In 1914, wealthy businessman Stephen Mather traveled to Yosemite. He found the trails to be in poor condition, cattle grazing in the meadows, and speculators cutting down the big sequoia trees despite rules against it. He dashed off a letter of complaint to the Secretary of the Interior, who happened to be an old college classmate of his, who wrote back, "Dear Steve, if you don't like the way the national parks are being run, why don't you come down to Washington and run them yourself?" Mather took him up on the offer, and this self-made millionaire found himself working for the U.S. government for $2,750 a year, the sum of which he gave to his secretary. So he worked for the government for free, basically, until he retired from this position. He soon found numerous issues affecting the parks. In addition to the ones that he had encountered when he was in Yosemite, the main issue was not enough funding and appropriations, because when a lot of these bills, like that first bill setting aside Yosemite, was like, this isn't going to cost us any money. So there was really no money to go to running a lot of the national parks. And so then there was like this collection of agencies, sometimes it was the Army, sometimes Maritimes, it was the U.S. Forest Service that were all responsible for these different aspects of running the park. So there was like no cohesive organization. So therefore, there was not anyone like really advocating for appropriate funding for the parks as well. And so he really envisioned a well-funded single government agency responsible for overseeing all of the national parks and monuments, which he would call the National Park Service. But it would take an act of Congress to get this to happen. So he enlisted writers from around the country to write articles and editorialize on his behalf. There was a lot more that I could include. Was like Mark Twain was like Hawaii's volcanoes, National Monument. Willa Cather also was Mesa Verde. So it was a couple other like really well-known writers at the time who were advocating on behalf of the national parks that Mather had personally asked for them to do that. Even the so here we're going to get to our artifacts. So the president of the National Geographic Society and editor, Gilbert Grosvenor, published a special issue of National Geographic in 1914 or 1916 titled The Land of the Best to promote the importance of national parks and encourage reader to support the creation of a national system. Mather made sure a copy of this magazine was placed on every congressman's desk. But Mather thought of something even more spectacular. He commissioned his friend Robert Sterling Yard, an editor at the New York Herald, to put together a book about the national parks titled National Parks Portfolio. The result was an almost 275-page hardbound book full of glossy photographs and short essays about every national park and every national monument in the country. It cost $48,000 to print, which, again, this is in 1916, so it's a huge sum of money. And clearly, Mather did not have the funding for this in his national park budget, so he used $5,000 of his own money, and he asked his wealthy friends to pay for the rest. Mather said the main object of this portfolio, therefore, is to present to the people of this country a panorama of our national parks and national monuments set side by side for their study and comparison. Each park will be found highly individual. The whole will be a revelation. This is the first really representative presentation of American scenery of grandeur ever published, perhaps ever made. And Mather was correct. This book was the first book to collect and showcase all together the geography of the United States in one place. It made an argument for American exceptionalism through its unique landscapes and its prescient idea to set them aside for the enjoyment of the people. He printed 275,000 copies, sending leather-bound copies to every member of Congress. He enlisted volunteers from the General Federation of Women's Clubs to mail the rest to likely park supporters from professional societies, members of chambers of commerce, and members of high society. The book was so popular that Mather ordered a smaller paperback version to be sold at national parks and bookstores. 2.7 million copies were sold during the first year alone. Mather's publicity was working as letters poured into Congress to support the establishment of a National Park Service. And on August 25th, 1916, President Woodrow Wilson signed the National Park Service Organic Act into law, establishing the National Park Service, transferring all national parks and monuments to its care. The mission states, the service thus established shall promote and regulate the use of the federal areas known as national parks, monuments, and reservations hereinafter, specified by such means and measures as conform to the fundamental purposes of said parks, monuments, and reservations, which purpose is to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such a manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. And that last part has been so important in the 100 years after that and been the point of contention for a lot of lawsuits. I won't get into all of those. But Ansel Adams. No presentation about art and activism in national parks would be complete without Ansel Adams, likely the world's most famous landscape photographer. He was born and raised in San Francisco and joined the Sierra Club when he was only 17 years old. He took 2 extended backpacking trips to the Kings Canyon area, which is south of Yosemite and north of Sequoia, in the 1920s, and he just fell in love with the area. Both John Muir and Stephen Mather had proposed that Kings Canyon be set aside as a national park and failed. But in the 1930s, Los Angeles was growing and looking for new sources of power and water, and they set their sights on Kings Canyon in order to build a dam. So in 1936, a bill was proposed in Congress to establish King Canyons National Park. Ansel Adams lugged his portfolios of photographs of Kings Canyon between the state and House of Representatives, meeting with 40 members of Congress. However, the bill did not pass. But Adams' fight was not over. In 1938, he published the Kings Canyon images as a book titled Sierra Nevada, The John Muir Trail. The book was 13 by 17 inches. It was 2 inches thick. The photographs had been individually cut and glued to the pages, and he sent a copy of the book to the director of the National Park Service, who gave it to the Secretary of Interior, Harold Ickes, who was convinced that the book made a successful argument for the establishment of Kings Canyon. Secretary Ickes then showed the book to President Franklin Roosevelt, who agreed and subsequently kept the book for himself. So then, on March 4th, 1940, Kings Canyon National Parks is signed into law by President Roosevelt. And Ickes was so impressed with Adams' work that he hired him to photograph all the national parks and bring the images back for prominent display in the Capitol. And that's how we came to know Ansel Adams as like the national park photographer. He wasn't paid very much either, but you know. All right, here's the part where this is the part that I know a lot about. So, despite their protection and designation as national parks and monuments, national parks were still not completely safe from developers. While the Colorado River has always been in the eye of the Bureau of Reclamation, it wasn't until post-World War II that it began to take a closer look at developing the river. In January 1953, the Colorado River Storage Project made its debut before Congress. This was a comprehensive bill for managing the Colorado River that included massive irrigation, canal, and water storage projects. The cornerstone of the bill was 2 dams. One you see not on here, and that is what I'm going to tell you about. It was Echo Park Dam on the Green River in Dinosaur National Monument, and the other in Glen Canyon down there in the corner. And then, of course, there's Flaming Gorge on the Utah-Wyoming border, and then we have our other dams there that you guys can see. All right. Novelist, historian, commentator, and Utah native Bernard DeVoto wrote an article for the Saturday Evening Post, of course, then one of the country's most famous and widely circulated newspapers. Shall we let them ruin our national parks, in protest of the proposal? This galvanized the conservation groups, and soon the preeminent Wilderness Society and the Sierra Club, as well as several others, formed a coalition to fight the proposal. David Brower, executive director of the Sierra Club, took the lead and began scheduling Green River rafting trips through Echo Canyon. People began arriving at Dinosaur National Monument by the boatload and floating through its canyons. When they returned home, they wrote letters, thousands of letters. They showed slides and snapshots to their friends and neighbors and encouraged them to write letters. The Congressional Mail was estimated to be running 80-1 in opposition to the dam proposal. In addition to the numerous float trips, personal letters of thousands to Congress, the articles in the Saturday Evening Post and Reader's Digest, and testimony before Congress about the negligible effects of the dam, the conservation groups were planning something really big. Wallace Stegner had just finished writing his award-winning, now we're back to Wallace Stegner. He had just finished writing his award-winning biography of John Wesley Powell, Beyond the 100th Meridian, and his familiarity with issues in the West, as well as his experience of running the river through Dinosaur National Monument, made him an ideal ally for the cause. At the urging of his friend Bernard DeVoto, Stegner wrote an article for the May 1953 issue of The Reporter against building a dam in Dinosaur National Monument or any national park or monument. The article caught the attention of David Brower, who reached out to Stegner to ask him to work on a book about Dinosaur National Monument. Thus, This Is Dinosaur, Echo Parks, and its country, its magic rivers, park country and its magic rivers, contains many photos and essays about the geology, archaeology, biology, and history as an eloquent explanation of why Echo Park and all of Dinosaur was so important. Stegner edited the volume, and he wrote the first essay in it, titled The Marks of Human Passage. In it, he writes, "It is a better world with some buffalo left in it, a richer world with some gorgeous canyons unmarred by signboards, hot dog stands, superhighways, or high-tension lines, undrowned by power or irrigation reservoirs. If we preserved as parks only those places that have no economic possibilities, we would have no parks. And in the decades to come, it will not only be the buffalo and the trumpeter swan who need sanctuaries. Our own species is going to need them too. It needs them now." This was a groundbreaking rhetorical tactic. A book like this is unabashedly conservation-minded picture book had never been published before. But in the face of what threatened Dinosaur, and with Knops, which was a publishing company, generous underwriting, it was worth the risk. Brower sent a copy to every member of Congress in the House and Senate, as well as to several high-ranking public government officials and to the editors of several major newspapers. For the first time, a book played a major role in a conservation campaign. Newspapers began to editorialize against the dam, including the New York Times. The conservation groups took out a full-page ad in the October 31st edition of the Denver Post in the form of an open letter to the supporters of Echo Dam, threatening an even bigger publicity campaign. Many senators withdrew their support of the dam, and on November 2nd, 1955, the conservationists won when language stipulating that no dam or reservoir constructed under the authorization of this act shall be within any national park or monument was inserted into the bill. This is one of the ads that they put out. Most of the people involved in the battle, including Wallace Stegner, attribute their victory to This Is Dinosaur. Mark Harvey, author of A Symbol of Wilderness, Echo Park and the American Conservation Movement, said, "This Is Dinosaur became the first book-length publication in conservation history that sought to publicize a park or wilderness preserve and to aid in a wilderness campaign." For the first time, environmentalists were starting to understand the powerful role that text played in an environmental debate. This book, the editorials, the full-page ads, all became cornerstone tactics for future environmental debates. Today, the battle to save Dinosaur National Monument is considered the first environmental battle of the modern era. It was the first time conservation groups came together in a broad coalition to save something, and won. As such, we also begin to see the grounding of modern environmental rhetorical tactics. Stegner's engagement with the fight to save Dinosaur National Monument for being dammed set him up for a lifetime of engagement with environmental issues. He would lend his voice in defense of natural places for the rest of his life, and even joined the board of directors for the Sierra Club. While conservation groups had succeeded in preserving the sanctity of the national park idea, Stegner was particularly concerned about the damming of Glen Canyon. In their zeal to fight for Dinosaur National Monument, they were willing to sacrifice Glen Canyon because it was not a national park. However, Stegner had warned David Brower about the drawbacks of the compromise he was willing to make. Stegner says, "If Brower listened to me, then Glen Canyon Dam might not have gone in, because I kept telling him Glen Canyon was a whole lot more worth saving than Dinosaur. But, you know, at the moment, Dinosaur was threatened. Glen Canyon wasn't, so that's the way it went." And of course, Glen Canyon was dammed and Lake Powell was created. However, Floyd Domney was not finished proposing dams. In 1963, as the director of the reclamation, Floyd Domney announced plans to build 2 dams on the Colorado River corridor in the Grand Canyon. The dams, as you can see, would be located at each end, in Diamond Creek, which I actually took out on a river rafting trip once. Where I took out for that river rafting trip would have been Bridge Canyon Dam, and the other on the north end, some of you may be familiar with it because that's kind of where Lee's Ferry is. A little bit down from that is where would be Marble Canyon Dam. California, Nevada, and Arizona were the ones kind of behind this proposal, and they attended. The whole purpose of these dams was actually only to generate money. The water wasn't needed. They wanted to create the electricity in order to be able to sell it back to customers to fund the whole rest of the project. Marble Canyon Dam would flood 53 miles of river, while Bridge Canyon Dam would have flooded 93 miles of river. Once again, the conservation groups, with David Brower of the Sierra Club taking the lead, set about fighting the construction of the dams in order to protect public lands. Given the success of This Is Dinosaur, David Brower commissioned nature photographer Elliot Porter's work on Glen Canyon to create a coffee table book titled The Place No One Knew as the cornerstone of his battle to save the Grand Canyon from being dammed. It was clear that text could play an important role in shaping opinions about wilderness and influence public opinion and political decisions. Brower saw an opportunity to appropriate the text as an instrument to disseminate the club's anti-dam platform. In the foreword for The Place No One Knew, Brower wrote, "The purpose of the Glen Canyon book is to forestall any further scenic resource disasters resembling the one imminent with the closing of the gates at Glen Canyon Dam. However, the place no one ever knew was just about dam building. The place it celebrated was already lost. It was outside the purview of public debate. The place no one knew could not save Glen Canyon. So it became a platform for the environmental movement, the Sierra Club in particular, to further their ideas about the value of wilderness, the price of progress, and man's relationship to nature. If the home of the human spirit is to be found in wilderness, then defiling wilderness in the name of technological progress becomes anathema to money changers in the temple." Several of the caption quotes in The Place No One Knew reinforce this idea, such as the quote from Wallace Stegner's Wilderness Letter, which alludes to the idea of trading wilderness for things associated with progress. "Something will have gone out of us as a people if we ever let the last remaining wilderness be destroyed, if we permit the last virgin forest to be turned into comic books and plastic cigarette cases, if we pollute the last clear air and dirty the last clean streams and push our paved roads through the silence." These ideals advocated for in The Place No One Knew became the defining ideals of the conservation movement and continue to be influential today when we talk about the value of national parks and public lands in our country. If Glen Canyon was a place that no one knew at the beginning of 1963, David Brower made sure that everybody knew about it by the end of 1963. He sent a copy of The Place No One Knew to every member of Congress, every member of the California State Legislature, every person of influence within the government, and every newspaper in America. He made copies available at discount prices. He even made a film of Glen Canyon, also titled The Place No One Knew, and showed it to school groups, church groups, civic groups across the country. And on June 9th, 1966, Brower took out a full-page ad in the front pages of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, saying, "Now only you can save the Grand Canyon from being flooded for profit." Another ad appeared in the same publications on July 25th, 1966, headline, "Should we also flood the Sistine Chapel so tourists can get nearer the ceiling?" The rhetoric seemed to work. One index of the public's concern was the rise in Sierra Club membership from 39,000 in 1966 to 67,000 in 1968. The scope of The Place No One Knew's distribution and influence shifted the role of photographs in conservation debates. Nature writer Rebecca Solnit observes the impact of what it was called was an exhibit format book, Porter's in particular, on the environmental movement. She writes, "Even those who were not great supporters of the publication program of the Sierra Club acknowledged that it was the books, particularly the photographic books, and among those particularly Porter's, that made the Sierra Club a visible force nationwide. It was a rare historic moment when art could achieve such profound political ends, and when the mere sight of such images was a powerful motivating force. No artist can ask for more than to live at a time when art can change the world. And because of this book and the outcry and the publicity, of course, there are no dams in Grand Canyon National Park. It worked. The role of art, whether it was painting, photographs, music, or texts, in the quest to help define, establish, and preserve national parks has been absolutely instrumental in those tasks. Without them, we may not have the vast national park system that is the envy of the rest of the world. And just to connect it back to the idea of the commons, and of course, in homage to Terry Tempest Williams, who lives not so far from Arches National Park, she says, you know, we think about the United States as being based on the individual, but the idea of the national parks is really based on the commons, the community. And they are an idea based on generosity, not just for our own species, but for all the species with whom we share this planet. As a nation, we have said in profoundly original terms, we value wild nature in place, we are of this place. It is our own declaration of both independence and interdependence. And so that concludes my talk with the idea of the commons and the importance of them to creating the national park. Thank you so much. I think we have time for some questions. If we have a few people on Zoom, and they may also be new to Zoom, so if you want to ask a question on Zoom, you can hit the raise your hand icon or raise your hand or unmute yourself, but anybody in the room has questions as well. Yeah, Tim.
Sure. Very interesting presentation. Appreciate you putting it all together for us. One thought I have as an archaeologist, and somebody, you know, Glen Canyon Dam, they did a bunch of salvage archaeology as they were building the dam. And of course, there are thousands of sites there.
Yep.
And in fact, I probably said this to half the people in this room, there were more people living in eastern Utah about 1,000 years ago than there are today. None of the towns were anywhere near as big as even, let's say, Helper, but there were more small communities.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if you think much about this idea of wilderness and virgin forests on the one hand, and the reality that these are actually cultural landscapes that have been used by people since at least the last ice age.
100%. So I mean, that's been one of the things that have really come out in the last 25 years when we're talking about environmental movement and preservation, is the reminder like, oh yeah, there were native peoples, indigenous peoples who lived here and created these landscapes that we considered, you know, wilderness. They were never really ever wilderness as in untouched by humans. In fact, right, when we're establishing Yosemite National Park, we're having to clear out the Awenatchee inhabitants who lived there. And that was the case for a number in Yellowstone as well. They had to clear out the, I believe it was the Sioux and some other native tribes who lived up in that area. So we're seeing in the case of the establishments of a lot of our national parks having to clear out the people that already lived there. I mean, even in the Smokies, when they established the Smokies, I mean, they had their, I mean, people had their homes, they had their farms. And so when we're setting aside a lot of our public lands, there were people already living there that had to either be bought out or chased out or cleared out. And so that's something that we've had to kind of reckon with over the last 25 years. I feel like the National Park Service is starting to recognize that. So when you go to national parks now, there's often a lot more signage and information about the indigenous peoples that lived there. And especially there's also different tribal groups who are consultants for the national parks. And I've written extensively about Bears Ears. And what I loved about Bears Ears is that was really one of the first national parks where tribes came together and asked the president, please establish this national park on our behalf. And so now when that law was passed establishing Bears Ears National Park, there's the tribal coalition that is identified as one of the groups that run the national monument. So I think we're starting to kind of dispel this idea that it's not pristine wilderness that we were preserving, that indigenous people had been caretakers of these lands for time immemorial. I think, though, at the time, when these ideas are being established, there's just such a voracious appetite for consumption of natural resources. I mean, they're just cutting down the sequoias, so I think there was just like, we got to save and protect these landscapes as best as we can. Yeah, Michael.
So I love that you're ending on this image because it kind of leads into my question, which kind of is a riff on the question I got at the end of my talk: what is the greatest threat to the commons and everything? And I think most people will think, at this right now in this moment, one of the greatest threats to the national parks is that they're kind of being loved to death by everyone. And I can't help but think, that we've almost done too good of a job at promoting some of these spaces, but I would love to hear your thoughts on how we can balance that preservation goal while also preserving access to these things.
I mean, that always was the tension in the mission, right? How do we both preserve and protect the cultural and natural resources are over here, and then also make them accessible for the people? So in doing, I learned a whole bunch. I did a lot of research for this in some new places that I haven't looked at before, and I learned a lot about Stephen Mather. And his goal was like, we just got to get people in there. We've got to develop hotels. We've got to develop gas stations. We've got to develop bathrooms. We've got to get eyes on these places, because without support from the people, we're not going to get any money. And that was when you go, there's like the Golden Circle. There was the whole like Western trip to go see all the national parks. But then after they at that time, even in the 1950s, 1960s, were starting to be loved to death, the conservation groups were starting to be concerned about access, and we're kind of saying, hey, well, this is also what about the animals that live there, right? And the species that we should be protecting in these national parks, and also they should be part of the consideration in the management plan for these. And so now, and I am a national park lover, national park connoisseur. When anybody says they're going to go to a national park, the first thing I say is, have you checked the reservation system? Because you can't just walk into a lot of these anymore. You can't just roll up to Yosemite National Park or Arches National Park, right?
Well, now you can. Yeah, Arches, they just did away with it.
Did they just do away with it?
Yeah. It was like last week or the week before.
They just barely did away with it. Because, I mean, yeah, besides the being loved to death, which is certainly an issue, when we have the shutdowns, though, right, when the government shut down and when the funding is cut, we see that there is also, so I think funding is still an issue, because there's not enough national park rangers, there's not enough people for interpretation centers, there's not enough people enforcing the rules, there's not enough people like doing all the things that need to be done to take care of our national parks. My other thought to that question would be climate change. I mean, I do think climate change does impact not only the preservation of species as they're having to move and migrate because their ranges are getting warmer, but I know like in the lower 48, Glacier National Park, how many glaciers are going to be in Glacier National Park by the end of the century, right? And so those are kind of things I kind of, think about as climate change. Yeah, anybody else?
Nobody else has questions. I have more questions.
Okay, go for it, Tim.
Sure, and it's sort of tying in there. As you say, it's this funding thing, and, and we saw these nice things. There's no cash attached to this appropriation. There's no appropriation, whatever it is. And, there's something, as you said, I was trying to figure out the exact number, but billions of dollars, $23 billion of deferred maintenance backlog in just the National Park Service, which doesn't include, for example, Utah's newest national monument, which is right down the road down here, Jurassic National Monument, which was mandated under the Dingell Public Lands Act, but saw no increase in funding or support for our local BLM Price Field Office in order to maintain this basically world-class paleontology quarry. And so I just wanted to re-emphasize that. So I guess it's more of a talking point than a question here. Just re-emphasize that this idea of, it's great, we can set aside and it'll preserve itself. It will not, right? If we don't, as a society, value it in a way. then you know.
And what's so unfortunate about that in our super polarized, hyper polarized society, like the one thing everybody agrees on is like national parks. Like national parks are the one thing that like bring everybody together. Like we're all there. Like when you ask people about national parks, it's like, 86, 90% like love national parks. And so that should be an area where we obviously all agree on, like, we should spend some tax dollars and that they should be important in the way that we fund them. But we just don't see that as being the case.
But Utah does step in and fund our Mighty Five during federal shutdowns. Now they get much of that back, but they recognize not only are they places we all care about, but as we're going to hear about next month, they're huge economic drivers for those communities around them.
But when those government shutdowns started occurring, what was it, like 2008, 2009, 2011, and Utah had to step in to run those, recognizing the economic drivers that they are. That's also when it started giving Utah the idea, like, oh, let's just be in charge of all of the land. The federal government can't do a good job of running it, so we can. And so that started a whole another issue for the Utah State Legislature. Yeah.
Really kind of funny. Sorry. So last year, right when the government shut down at the beginning of October, I was traveling with a friend. I did a hike. I did with a friend. We did the Narrows and everything. And then the next day, which happened to be October 1st, we went to Bryce Canyon. And we got in. I was like pleading with someone in the visitor center, let me give you money for this. And they're like, no, sorry, we can't accept any money. The government shut down. But you're here. It's like, sorry, we can't. I want to give you money. I was begging.
National Park Foundation.
I just want to say I'm so happy you talked about Thomas Moran and Albert Bierstadt, two of my all-time favorite landscape artists. They're total rock stars.
Seeing them live in Washington is incredible.
Yeah,
I agree.
I stand in front of those paintings.
Yeah.
The size of them.
We drove up to Cody one year to see a Albert Bierstadt exhibit,
Yeah.
and it was fantastic.
Can you talk about why, Noel, a little bit, like why they made them so big and like?
I think they're just their style. I mean, they were the luminous Hudson River School artists that really they used that grand style and brought images of these western lands, the Rocky Mountains, to people back east, and like people were like, really? They're like, I mean, the landscape looks like
it's
that.
all about spectacle. And,
Spectacle. This grand style, this grand.
Like we're not no TVs and no movies.
Yeah,
like you're
right.
thinking of, like this is like the one way that they get
they
to
did
see
it in a
these
way
things.
that the photography really kind of couldn't do it. You know?
And I will say, with those two huge paintings I mentioned, the ones that you do see, I mean, $10,000, $25,000 back then was a lot of money. So they had the money to be able to buy the canvas, buy the paint, and make them on such a huge scale. And I think I don't want to be cynical, but I always that money for art is always helpful and makes it better.
It's not surprising that those paintings were that influential, because I don't know hardly anything about art, and my son and I just stood with our jaws on the ground.
Oh yeah, it's
20 minutes just going, oh my gosh, they're just amazing.
But that's a good point, right? That basically all of the early impetus for this is coming from the wealthy. The person who's a self-made millionaire who can take on a peon job as the head of the National Park Service. And again, it's not the public writ large that are preserving these commons. It is well-intentioned people with means who are putting their means towards self-publishing a book in order to get
100%.
You know what I mean?
Who was
Yeah.
the biggest people to expand our national park system is Rockefeller. He bought up and donated so much of the land. I mean, he like 5 national parks are like his, that he just bought up the land and then donated it back.
If you had to get rid of one national park.
all right. I never.
I've even been, so we do a lot of national park trivia in our house, and the smallest national park unit is in Philadelphia.
Oh, darn it. Nope.
It's this,
I thought it was the St. Louis Arch.
That's what I thought.
The smallest national park unit? No, it's a tiny little house in Philadelphia that used to, I can't remember his name. It's like a Theodore, not Kaczynski, but it was a Polish revolutionary in Philadelphia. And it's just like this, like a 200
So it's not, so
foot.
it's like, not
Monument,
not a park,
maybe.
park, but like more of a, it's a unit.
It's
of
a
it.
monument.
Okay.
It's a
Yeah,
monument.
I think the smallest, like, national designated part is the Gateway Arch and Dred Scott.
The St. Louis Courthouse with the Dred
But
Scott.
that just became a national
the
park
basement.
in the last like 5 years.
Yeah, it's very recent because like when I growing up in Missouri, it's like we don't have any national parks in Missouri. Then just randomly I'm on Wikipedia, I was like, wait, when did that happen?
Yeah. I took a group of students there 1 year. It was a monument.
Yeah,
I took a group of students there 4 years
Gates of
later.
the
It
Ark,
was a
I've
park.
been to all of
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
You could hunt in them.
Well, it's 7. Does anybody have any other questions?
Good job.
Well, I do.
Well, one question. Okay, one more.
My speaker series, I put
One
this together.
more. One more.
I'm just kind of, and so we talked a little bit about threats, and you don't see a lot of this kind of artist activism in the same way, or at least it's not as prevalent today. So if you, Michael N. Nelson, were to put out a call for a new writer, artist, activism in our sort of like social media age, how would you approach this? How could we approach a new activism to protect these lands, not just the beautiful parks you see on Instagram, but lesser known places that are just as equally, what's the word I'm looking for, worthy of protection? And how can we get them engaged?
So I've been thinking a lot about that question, working on the book project that I'm supposed to be working on, because really, so I'm like, how influential is social media in activism on behalf of public lands? Because honestly, what I am really still seeing from conservation groups like the Glen Canyon Institute is they just made film. They're doing movies. They just did this great documentary that was part of like Telluride Film Festival and some other film festivals. That's just absolutely captivating. So I still think people are doing a lot of film. Like Don Kirshner just did a short film about the re-emerging Glen Canyon because, of course, and this is gonna be in the news this summer because everybody knows that I did not have to shovel any snow this entire winter, as neither did any of you for the most part. And so we're snowpack on record, and the lowest that Lake Powell was in 2022. It is going to be lower than it was going to be in 2022, and that is where your Gregory Arch is under the water. We're going to see Gregory Arch come again, of course, Cathedral in the Desert. So we're really starting to see the reemergence of Glen Canyon, and a lot of studies are being done, scientific and otherwise, and so I think that people are doing a lot of work with film and photography. They continue to do that. And books, like when Grand Staircase, so I love this story. So, good, I can tell this story. It's a Terry Tempest Williams story, too. So when Grand Staircase Escalante was being proposed, they were talking to President Clinton about setting it aside as a monument. And so Terry Tempest Williams and Stephen Trimble get together and they say, we're going to do the place no one knew. We're going to do it for Grand Staircase Escalante. So they pulled together some of their writer friends, some photographers. They put together this book really fast in like a few months. It's called Testimony. They sent it to all of the members of Congress. And when President Clinton came down to declare Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, he held up a copy of Testimony and he said, this is the book that made the difference in establishing this national monument. I mean, that was 1996, but it still is, we're still using that visual imagery to help establish national parks and national monuments, I think.
There's a really cool project. It's called the Returning Rapids Project. Yes. That's using photography also in a scientific manner of basically before and after photos to document the changes along the Colorado River. Because another thing in addition to the low snowpack is all of the dams are being filled up. So they're being silted up. We're not going to have even the capacity in those dams that we have had in the past. So,
Yeah, to see the river cut like new path or kind of find its re-emerging path, they're calling it the Domini layer, the layer of silt. Yes, the Domini layer, the layer of silt there in Lake Powell. But I could talk about Glen Canyon Lake Powell for a really long time.
Is this part of your book project?
Not this exact, not all of the national park stuff, but all of the parts, the stuff from when we're talking about Glen Canyon after, because it's my book project's all on Glen Canyon. There's actually a lot of literature and film and art about Glen Canyon. So, yeah.
I don't know if you knew this, maybe you did, but USU Special Collections has the Sierra Club collection.
Okay. I've seen it at some other places, but anyways, yeah.
At least they have the Southern Utah Alliance part of it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah, I'll check that out.
At least last time.
Yeah.
Any other?
Great job, Michael.
Right, before everyone leaves, I just have to put in a plug for Doug's talk in exactly 1 month, March 25th, 6 p.m. here. So, yeah, just another Wednesday, and that'll be closing out our series for this semester. So, please, everyone, come then. Thank you.
No pressure, but I think we'll get to see more cool images of national parks.
I'm guessing. Yes.
I'll be
That's exactly it. Doug is going to be talking about the economic impact. Which I love. There was a quote you had on this about like being no economic value or whatever, and I was like, well, why there is economic value.
Yeah.
So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
What about there, Michael?